Good afternoon and a warm welcome to all members of the Radley community and to our school partners who've joined us today on Zoom. My name's Caroline Monaghan and I'm responsible for the Beyond Radley Career Speaker Programme, a series of talks designed to give you a live insight into the world of work. Today we're joined by Nick Lang, who's going to talk to you about gap year travel, an exciting prospect and something that's worth researching extensively before you go to make sure you get the best experience and also come back safely. I'll introduce you to our guest speakers shortly, but before we begin, a few reminders. Please keep your microphone on mute. If you have questions, please feel free to put them on the chat and there'll be a Q&A session at the end. And I have to let you know that the event will be recorded so that others can watch it afterwards. So now I'm going to introduce you to Nick Lang, founder of Steps Travel and someone who's traveled extensively in his lifetime, visiting well over 100 countries and now helps families to plan holidays all over the world. At age 22, he drove from London to Singapore with no phone, no guidebooks, no GPS and no maps. In 2005, he rode a motorbike across Russia from London to Vladivostok and then around the Mediterranean. And since then, he's ridden through Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, USA, and to the top of Norway, just to name a few. So he certainly has some great experiences to share and some stories to tell about traveling the world. Over to you, Nick.
Caroline, thank you very much indeed. Hello, everybody. First thing I want to say is that I am not an expert on gap years. When I was at school, they hadn't been invented. But what I have done is travel through a number of countries on my own in some quite remote areas. And the principles of traveling alone and in remote areas are the same as to whether you're my age or your age. So what I'm going to do is just is crack on with my, where are we? Screen. Okay, there we go. So what do I want to cover with you this afternoon? I'm not going to take all your time, but we'll talk for about sort of 25 minutes, something like that. First of all, a word on COVID, which is of course affecting travel worldwide, and anyone who's looking at taking a gap year this year, you need to be aware of this. And I don't have a crystal ball, but we'll look at it. Secondly, what do you want to achieve on your gap year? And I think that's a really important fact. Some thoughts on what you might do on your year, perhaps a few places you haven't thought of. And then we'll look at preparing for traveling in remote areas. And finally, a few useful tips which might come in handy. So first of all, why isn't that actually turning? There we go. COVID-19. Vaccines, as you know, are a game changer when it comes to travel. The problem with vaccines is that most of the population who are going to receive vaccines are in Europe and North America, which is going to leave the rest of the world slightly behind. And at the moment, you have a list of 33 countries which require a 14-day quarantine when you come back to the UK. And the problem with that is that it blankets most of South America and most of Africa. So if you're looking and thinking about gap year travel, and really we've got to be thinking right the way through this winter, I would think those countries, unless you can handle 14 days in a hotel on your return, might be off the cards. To make matters worse, Asia, which is the other alternative, most of the countries there are closed right now, and it's impossible to get into them. Sri Lanka's open, Nepal and Bhutan are both open, but many of the others are closed. I think they're going to open because so many of them are dependent on foreign tourists and the money they bring. But as I said, no crystal ball, I'm afraid, and you do have to look at that. Don't look at the government foreign office advice on what you can do, because that's really the most unhelpful website of any. You need to delve a little bit deeper and actually go into this country-specific government sites and check what they're saying about allowing people to come in. Inevitably, it's going to involve testing both as you leave here and before you come back again. Anyway, that is what it is. So let's why take a gap year and what you want to achieve. I think the very first port of call of anyone who's thinking about a gap year, particularly if you're thinking of traveling into some more remote countries, is to go to the Royal Geographical Society in London. They have an entire section devoted to expeditions and gap year travel. They've got a map room, and I appreciate that obviously maps are all online now, but should you want some help and advice, they've got people on hand, and an afternoon or a morning in the Royal Geographical Society to help you plan where you're going to go is incredibly useful. The people there are well traveled and can give you all kinds of advice, and they support major expeditions all over the world. So a really good starting point. But I think the key really for you is to decide what you are going to get out of your gap year. And there are two ways of looking at it. Either you're going to pickle your liver and drink your way through your gap year, or you're going to take yourself off into a remote corner of the world and test yourself and your ability to cope with unfamiliar areas. And I think you need to understand that while, for instance, doing a ski season will be huge fun, it's not going to make a jot of difference if you put that on your CV, because no one's going to be that impressed. On the other hand, if you say you have driven a car from, I don't know where, down from London to Cape Town, that is infinitely more impressionable and is an immediate talking point when you have an interview with anybody. So I think bear that in mind. You've got to decide what you want to get out of your gap year. And again, the Royal Geographical Society will help you that and talk you through it. It's got to be fun, but any of these things you do will absolutely be fun because that's what you've got to make of them. So what I thought I'd do is just look at a few ideas that you might not have thought of, given the sort of current situation. The first, of course, you could do nothing. And you could sit at home and watch TikTok. And personally, I have to say, I'm not necessarily a great fan of gap years. I think it's a shame that you can't go from school to university and then take a gap year after university, which would be a great deal more rewarding. But the fact is that the society we live in, it's difficult to do that because you're all job hunting. So the gap year does crop up. But I know some universities, certainly when one of my sons was going to university, the university said they wouldn't allow him to do a gap year. And if he took a gap year, he then had to reapply the following year and compete with the next year's applicants. So that is another fact. You've got the ski season, which I have mentioned, and I'm sure it's very useful to learn how to make beds, probably to do a little bit of cooking and have great fun. But it isn't going to really benefit you as an individual, because within 10 years, that ski season will seem just like a ski holiday. You will have no real memories to look back on. There are a great many gap year companies out there. I'm naming 4 there. There are lots of others, and they can really offer some very rewarding experiences around the world, volunteering in any number of different countries. And you just have to go onto their different websites and see what you want to do. The problem that I look at that and say is that it's pretty much like a holiday. You're going to a company, you're paying them some money, they organize it. So there's nothing for you to organize. Again, you're not testing yourself. You're just buying a package. And yes, you're going to live in a remote area. And yes, you're going to deal with people who come from a very, very different life to your own. But at the end of the day, you're not really testing your ability to plan. But I'm not knocking it. They are incredibly useful and do have a look and search for others. There's lots and lots of them available on the internet. You can, of course, just go off and travel with friends. And I name, a number of countries there. I think that particularly if you are going on to university to study, Spanish and maybe Portuguese, then, South America is an obvious place to go to. And that it's always worth looking at the language side of whichever country it is. And there are a whole mass of different places, and I'm not going to suggest any of them, but they are out there, and I'm sure you've got lots of friends who've been to many of the places I've listed there already. But I want to sort of look at perhaps places you haven't thought of. So the first one is Nepal. Nepal was the great hippie hangout during the 60s and the 70s, and it's kind of gone out of fashion in the last sort of 30 years, and it's slowly coming back. It is open at the moment. COVID is very low. Where is it? There you got it, just sitting at the top of India. Very easy to get to. There are international flights in nowadays. You can fly from pretty much anywhere in Europe. But an amazing country to go. It's a trekking destination. So you start in Kathmandu and maybe spend a few days in wandering around Kathmandu, and you'll find masses and masses of your age group doing exactly the same thing. But it's when you set out into the mountains that it all starts to come alive. And you can trek for, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks up there. And again, you can decide, you can hire porters to take with you. It sounds grand, but actually you will be amazed how cheap labor is, and they're all desperate to earn some money. So you can either go camping, or when you're up in the mountains, you can stay in little rest houses, which are very clean, very, very simple, but you get a bed, you get a bathroom, and they give you breakfast. And there's always somewhere nearby where you can, get some supper, and while you're on, and then and take a picnic lunch with you. And there are well-worn tracks, there are well-worn routes, and always people to guide you. That's a sort of typical scene out there with little villages, where you can stay, and there's yaks there grazing in the foreground. And of course, you can always do the Everest Base Camp, which is a 2-week trek. And once you get there, you have got Everest right up above you, and then it's 2 weeks back out again. So a longish journey, but it's relatively inexpensive. You're walking, cheap places to stay, and good fun. But the other thing about Nepal is that it also has river rafting. And in the western part of Nepal, you can do a 3-day river rafting trip down, camping out at night. And it takes you from the high ground of Nepal right down to the Indian plains. Once you get down to the Indian plains, there is a wildlife preserve down there, and again, lots of cheap places to stay, and you can go on safari very much like you would in Africa, except of course you're seeing different animals, and this one, if you don't know, is the one-horned Indian rhinoceros. I love Nepal. I've always loved Nepal, and the people are genuinely the friendliest and nicest you could meet anywhere in the world. Another place to consider, which you may not have heard of, is Ladakh. Now, Ladakh sits way up in the top corner of India, up in the Karakoram Mountains, and bordered by China to the north. It is the last bastion of true Tibetan Buddhism, if that means anything. So the Dalai Lama is, he was originally from Tibet, and they worship him as the head of their church, effectively. It was actually closed. It was a closed area of India up until about 1996. So in comparison to much of the India and that part of the world, it's relatively, and I say relatively, unspoilt, particularly once you get out of the towns. But to get there, you can fly from Delhi. The problem is you're flying into 4,000 meters So that's what, 13, 14,000 feet. And the altitude really hits you if you do that. And you have to take a couple of days to really let your body settle down and adjust. Otherwise, you have splitting headaches. Or you can drive it, and it's about a 4-day drive. But once you get there, it's the most magical place. This is Leh, the main town. And if you look closely, you've got a mixture of there's the two ladies in their traditional dress, which is very, very commonplace up there. But once you get out of the town, you get into this barren wilderness, and it's a trekking destination, rather like Nepal, but very, very wild. Some old towns sitting there, and lots of monasteries as well. This is Stoke, and that is the Queen of Stoke's palace in the background. Wonderful autumn colors. And that's a monastery at Tiksay. So that's full of, I don't know how many monks live there. Over 1,000 monks live in that building. And the plus point about Ladakh, in contrast to many of the other places out there, it's a summer destination. So the time you would go there is sort of June through to September, which is in complete contrast to most of the Far East, which makes it an interesting alternative. If you're not doing any of those things and we get a little bit more adventurous, you could consider doing a bicycle trip or a car trip. Somebody I work with in his gap year bicycled the length of the Mekong. So he started up on the Tibetan plateau and he then bicycled however many thousand miles it was all the way down the Mekong to Vietnam. And he had a remarkable trip. Or you can do a car journey. And in fact, some of you will remember Albie Tufnell, who I think left just last year. He's been planning a trip in Ethiopia, flying to Addis Ababa, buying a car in Addis, and then driving through Ethiopia into Eritrea, and then across into Egypt and up the Nile to Luxor. I mean, that's a really fantastically adventurous thing to do, and I recommend that hugely. You can, of course, do the great Pan American Highway from the north of America all the way down to the south. The issue with that, just so you're aware of it, is you'll see those two, the C and the D, marked right in the middle. That is the Darien Gap. There is no road. You cannot drive the length of America. It's thick jungle, and the only way around it is by boat. If you're taking a car, or if you are hitching or doing something, or a bicycle, you can actually fly. But it does mean that, you know, to do the whole thing, and many people do it, it's a long trip, but you can break it and maybe just do the South American section rather than the top end. Big open distances in both North and South America. Probably the best way to do it is in a camper van, and maybe, you know, 3 of you in a camper van, which means, of course, that you can drive as much as you want and stay wherever you want, you know, during your trip. When I was motorbiking out in Costa Rica, when we crossed into Nicaragua, there must have been 20 other cars who were all doing that Pan-American highway trip. So you're going to meet people the entire time, swap stories. They'll tell you where to stay. They'll tell you where to eat, what to see, what to do, where to hang out. It's an amazing route. And then right at the end, you get down to, well, that's in Bolivia, the salt flats in Bolivia, which you can drive across. And then you end up down in Tierra del Fuego, right down at the very bottom of Chile. And as you can see in the foreground, a camper van of sorts. An amazing journey. Alternatively, you can do something like the Mongol Rally. Some of you may have come across the Mongol Rally. It's run by an organization called the Adventurists. They run a number of different trips. One of them, I think, is in rickshaws in India. This is the big one. It starts in London, and the idea is to get to to Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. I think they're now ending in Russia. Sorry about this. There's the start. You can drive any car. You're restricted on your engine size, although you can get special permission to take odd vehicles like ambulances or even buses on the route. But how you get from A to B is entirely up to you. You have to plan it, and it's a great journey. That's the alternative route when you go down through Turkey and Central Asia across Iran. Don't be put off by Iran. It's an amazing country to go to. As a travel company, we've sent people there for the last 25 years and never ever had a single problem with any of them. They all come back thinking, what is all the fuss about in the British media? So don't be put off by it. But that's the sort of terrain you're going to cross with your maps and your GPS and your planning. I'm not sure where that is, but I suspect it's Mongolia of somewhere. As I say, people do it in all sorts of shapes and sizes of cars. It's entirely up to you. Some of them do it in fancy dress. But the start and the finish is obviously a massive party. That's the finish in, I think, in Ulan-Ude in Russia. Finally, if you really want to test yourself, you can join the Clipper Round the World yacht race. Some of you may have heard of this. It goes every year. Those are the legs. You can sign up for 1 leg, 2 legs, the whole lot, whatever you feel like, and you're on a boat like that. No sailing experience is required, but when it comes to building you as an individual and building your character, you're in there with people of all ages, and you can choose what you think would be the most exciting leg to travel on, and you'll get some interesting times, I imagine. Anyway, what I thought I'd just look at is briefly look at some preparation and planning for your gap year. First of all, the weather. The weather is going to decide where you go, and it's a really important point to bear in mind. You are not going to go to India between May and September because it's either so unbearably hot or raining very hard. Indonesia, Bali is a summer destination. You can go in the winter, but again, it's raining, not necessarily every day, but it certainly will be raining. Africa, all the safari countries, Kenya, Tanzania, Botswana, they all have what they call the long rains and the short rains, and you want to avoid them. So planning, looking at the weather patterns of the countries you're going to will determine where you're going to. Nepal, as I've mentioned earlier on, why do you go in October, November? Because the monsoon that occurred 2 months before clears the air. So you get these crystal clear blue skies and those magnificent views of the Himalayas. Go in April, May, and yes, you've got flowers out, but it tends to be cloudy and you don't always see the mountains, so you have to decide on that. The Royal Geographical Society, harking back, if you are thinking of going on a remote trip, if you did think of doing, for instance, the Mongol Rally or driving South America, then I would highly, highly recommend going to the Royal Geographical Society and participating in their 2-day first aid course. It is a really, really worthwhile weekend. It's not looking at how to treat a headache. What it's going to do is look at how to deal with your driving partner when he crushes his finger or he falls over and breaks his leg. It's how to fix a splint. It's how to assess damage to somebody in a remote area, and so that you don't panic and you know what to do. I did it before I motorbiked across Russia. It was a very good standby to have in the back of your mind to know that if something did happen, you knew what to do about it. I think I've probably forgotten it all now, but as long as you do it, soon before you travel, it's there at the forefront of your mind. The other thing I mentioned is a TEFL. Some of you may know about TEFL. It stands for Teaching English as a Foreign Language. And the qualification of a TEFL enables you to make money wherever you are in the world. Regardless of whether you can speak the local language, you can teach somebody to speak English. There are lots and lots of courses run all over Britain in many different places. And again, a useful little qualification if you're doing a longer trip and you think you might stay somewhere and need to earn a few pennies to feed yourself or get a hotel. So a TEFL is most useful. And I also just throw in a few other things to remember to take with you, which is people often forget about their teeth. Nothing worse than having toothache when you're traveling. Take a dental pack, which will include a few essentials like a temporary filling if your filling falls out, and some other things to kill pain. A first aid kit, obviously, and the great thing is to ask your doctor to give you a broad spectrum antibiotic. That'll cover all sorts of things like if you get a tooth abscess or you get a really bad upset stomach, when you're miles from anywhere, and it'll just tide you over until you can get to see a doctor. And of course, make sure you're up to date with all the injections, such as tetanus and hepatitis. Don't go and ask a GP because, bless them, they try their hardest, but they don't really understand what is necessary in a lot of the countries. Go to a specialist travel clinic, and it's very easy to find them around the place. And then finally, money, which is one of the keys, obviously, to traveling. Credit cards and paying for things. There's a credit card facility called Revolut. Revolut, I use the whole time. Many of you may know about it. What it is, it's a straightforward credit card. It's a MasterCard, which you use in the usual way. But the app on your phone allows you to transfer currency on the app, and you can hold as many different currencies as you want. So, if you transferred £100 into the account, you can put 20 into rubles and 20 into Spanish peseta. Oh no, they don't exist now. To euros, and 20 into dollars and hold it. So it means that if you're if you're traveling in America and you've got dollars held in your account, and you go to an ATM machine and you pull out $20, there's no exchange rate. The exchange rate has already been done. The other beauty about it is it is very easy for your darling parents to be able to top up your funds should they need to. If you're in a hole somewhere in the back of Beyond, they can just transfer money into what is effectively a bank account, and you've got it anywhere. One of the other plus points is it comes with what they call a virtual credit card. And that means that if you're mugged, if your credit card is stolen, online, you have a virtual credit card. And it means you can buy an air ticket or a hotel room and pay for it using this virtual credit card, which is incredibly useful. Always travel with a spare wallet and fill it with out-of-date credit cards, $30 in cash, and some old bits and pieces so that it looks as though it's being used. So when you're mugged, you can hand it over, and they look at the cash and they won't look at the date on the credit cards. If you can, take a spare credit card. Not always easy to hide it, but try and hide it somewhere. And again, spare cash. If you can roll up, a couple of $100 into a tight little roll and put it in a shoe or some belts come with a little cash pocket tucked into the inside of them somewhere, so that if all else fails, you've got something to get you out of a hole if the worst comes to the worst. I've probably bored you long enough. I hope that's thrown some ideas out and given some ideas, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that anyone has about anything. Not how to raise money for your gap year.
Thanks, Nick. That was absolutely brilliant. Really fascinating. You've given me a massive yearning to go on holiday now and travel. But everyone, please do put any questions you have on the chat, and I can put them to Nick. I've got a couple that I'll ask you, Nick, which you may or may not know the answer to, but I'll ask them anyway. So in terms of gap year travel, are you aware if you can get any kind of insurance policies for gap year travel?
Yeah, I forgot to mention that. You can. Insurance is a tricky one traveling. The first thing I would say is you will be told that you can get insurance from, if you use your credit card to buy packages. The travel insurance you get on that, or the travel insurance you buy if you go to Boots or any of the high streets, is simply not good enough for traveling in remote areas. There is a company, God, my mind's gone blank, Campbell Irvine. It's called Campbell Irvine. They are specialists in travel insurance. They have their own policy, and it's good for anywhere in the world. And you can get annual insurance coverage for gap year. There tend to be initial restrictions on the amount of time you're away, but you can extend it as long as you tell them when you take out the package. And it's a very, very comprehensive package, and it includes emergency evacuation by aeroplane if you need it, and it's not that expensive.
Okay, that sounds worth doing. On a more general point, and again, this might be subjective to the individual, but perhaps from your perspective, is it best to travel with somebody else or in a group? And in your experience, I don't know if you have traveled with people, I imagine you have. What are the best types of people to travel with?
Falling out with the people you travel with is the worst nightmare.
Yes, it is.
We've all done it, and we'll probably all do it again. I think traveling in a small group is probably a fun way to do it. Particularly if you're going through a number of different countries. I mean, if you're doing something like the Mongol Rally, or if you're driving, the Pan American Highway, you need people to help you, to share the experience. Not least of which, if you're sitting in India and I don't know, you want to go into a bank and you've all got backpacks, maybe someone sits outside with the backpacks and two of you go into the bank and, get the money or whatever. It's very useful. And three is a safer number. Although 3 is often a bad number because 2 often gang up against 1. So maybe 4 is a better number. But yes, I would definitely recommend having more than one person. It's fun, and to be able to chat about things and make plans for the following day anyway.
Absolutely, and I guess if you travel on your own, then you have to take extra precautions as well.
Yeah.
When you're sleeping and all those sorts of things. So definitely to think through there.
Yeah.
I've got some, again, please, everyone do ask your questions on the chat. Nick knows lots of stuff about a lot of places. So if you just want to ask about the place that he may know, I'm going to ask one of those questions. What is the friendliest or the nicest culture that you've ever experienced in your travels?
All the Islamic countries. To me are the very best. I mean, the hospitality of Islam makes traveling in places like Pakistan, all over the Middle East, an absolute joy, where they will share their last piece of bread with you. And but I think every culture has its pluses and its minuses, and wherever you go, it's an eye opener. Anywhere you go is different to living in England. And I think that's one of the absolute joys of travel. People travel for many different reasons. Some people will travel just for seeing scenery. But I travel for people. I enjoy meeting people, and I enjoy learning from people, because it's very easy to sit in our Western splendor and believe that we have the most sophisticated culture in the world. But actually, once you get under the fingernails of India or Syria or wherever it is, you learn that these countries have just a wealth of culture that we don't understand, and we have so much to learn from them, and so much that we have lost by becoming so dependent on money to a greater extent. They still retain, and it's just a joy to understand that and listen to them.
Well, thank you. And in terms of, is there anywhere that you've traveled to where you felt quite insecure and that it's very, very dangerous?
No. I think as long as you're careful, I think one of there are various things. One thing I always say to people is you must never ever judge a country by your own standards. You can't go and travel through India or Russia or wherever it is and look at it as an Englishman. You have to understand the country from their perspective. So you can go to India and you find, beggars on the street, and you can look at them and you think, oh God, it's so awful. But then you have to understand why there are beggars on the streets. And in fact, when you understand why, and it's all to do with religion and giving money to people, which enhances your potential of better reincarnation, it all starts to make sense. And again, traveling, in a country, as long as you understand their culture, as long as you understand their rules, you can travel quite safely. The difficulty, I think, or the problems that arise is, particularly with Westerners, is wearing inappropriate clothes in countries which are actually traditionally very conservative. If you go into the Middle East, for instance, and you wear shorts, for instance, walking down a street because it's hot, you have to understand that in the Middle East, shorts are considered underpants, and because that's what they wear under those flowing robes, is they wear shorts, and to them it's their underpants. So they look at you and you think, why are you wearing your underpants walking down the street? And it can lead to trouble. And skimpy clothes, I know it sort of sounds sexist, but girls, particularly in the far east, are prone to wearing sort of skimpier clothes than they should, and it's offensive to locals, and it leads to trouble. So obey the local cultures, understand the local cultures, and you usually travel quite safely.
Brilliant, thank you. And has the language barrier ever been a problem in the countries that you visited?
Yes, in very remote areas, but so some areas in eastern Turkey, Iran, yes. Yeah, in remote areas, but you can always get by. You can always make the right signs, and people, they want to understand you. You're a foreigner, you're a white face, you suddenly arrived in this area, and you're a novelty, to everybody who's there. So they actually want to help you, and they want to understand what you need. So despite the fact that you can't speak the language, you can always make yourself understood one way or the other.
That's brilliant, Nick. I've got one last question for you, unless anybody else has anything to ask. It's a bit of a desert island disc question here, which is what's the one thing that you would never travel without? You can't say your phone. So
wet ones. Wet ones.
Well, like a wet wipe.
Like wet wipes.
Yes.
Yep. You can do everything with wet wipes. You can clean your windscreen. You can do absolutely anything and use it as a disinfectant in your hands. So yeah, I always travel with wet wipes.
Top tip. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Well, so thank you so much, Nick. That was great. Really useful, really comprehensive. Some great ideas for places to travel to. And now I feel like going on holiday. So, but yeah, we'll have to hold my powder dry on that one. So thank you very much indeed. Now, before we go, I'm going to tell you about the talks that we've got lined up for next week, which will be our final week of Beyond Radley Career Talks ahead of you all returning to school on the 8th. On Monday, we've got a panel of investment experts from different parts of the financial world to give you a broader perspective of some of the careers in finance. On Wednesday, we have Theo Bromfield, who currently works for an environmental charity managing a portfolio of 17 ground-based wildlife conservation projects in Africa and Asia. And that should be a fascinating talk. And on Friday, we'll have Will Donaldson, who's going to talk to you about a career in the property industry and the breadth of interesting roles that are available to you right now. So thank you very much for attending. Thanks to you, Nick, for coming today, and we hope you all have a lovely weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.